So I need to talk about something happening in Cleveland right now. Because if you've been half watching this quarterback situation from a distance, you are missing one of the wildest reversals I have seen in a long time. A guy who was drafted specifically to make another guy look replaceable is now the one whose name gets brought up like a punchline. And the guy who was supposed to be replaced is suddenly the one every analyst can't stop praising. I want to walk you through exactly how we got here, because the way this flipped is almost too clean to be real, and honestly, the deeper you dig into it, the more it starts to feel like one of those stories the league writes on its own, without anyone's help. I've watched a lot of quarterback competitions play out over the years, and most of them are messy. They drag on, they get muddled by politics, by coach speak, by front offices trying to protect a decision they already regret. This one isn't like that. This one has a clean beginning, a clean villain, if you want to call it that, and a resolution that's writing itself in real time, right in front of everyone's eyes. That's rare, and that's exactly why I couldn't just skip past it. Let's rewind for a second, because context matters here. Deshaun Watson has barely been available to this franchise. Injuries, absences, setbacks that seem to compound on top of each other year after year, and that reality alone forced the Browns to treat their quarterback room like an open question instead of a settled depth chart. You can't build a franchise around a guy who can't stay on the field, no matter how much money is already sunk into that contract. Add in the fact that there's a brand new coaching staff walking into this building with zero emotional attachment to decisions made by the previous regime, and you've got the perfect conditions for a shakeup. New coaches don't inherit loyalty. They inherit tape, they inherit practice reps, and they make their own judgments regardless of what story the front office wants told. That's the backdrop. Now let's get into the actual story, because this is where it gets interesting. Last summer, everything was set up perfectly for Dylan Gabriel. He was the guy the old front office bet on. Third-round pick, remember that number, because it matters a lot later. Shedeur Sanders, meanwhile, was dealing with an oblique injury and could barely take the field. So while Sanders watched from the sideline, Gabriel got every opportunity to plant his flag. He went 13 for 18 in his preseason debut. Solid outing. And then he stood in front of a camera and said something that would follow him for an entire year. He said there's entertainers and there's competitors, and that his job is to compete. Now on the surface, that's just a guy talking about work ethic. Later, when reporters pushed him on it, Gabriel insisted he wasn't talking about anyone specific, that he was really addressing the media circus in general, not his own rookie quarterback room rival. And look, maybe that's technically true. Maybe in his own head, that's exactly what he meant. But intent and perception are two completely different things. And in a market like Cleveland, with cameras on every single practice rep, perception wins every time. Nobody watching believed that explanation for a second. Everyone in that building, everyone covering that team, understood exactly who he was talking about. Sanders had the bigger spotlight, the bigger name, the bigger media circus following him everywhere he went, despite falling 2 full rounds further in the draft than Gabriel did. So when Gabriel drew that line between entertainers and competitors, it landed like a shot. It wasn't just a rookie being confident. It felt like the entire front office speaking through him, justifying a decision that put him ahead of a more talented, more hyped prospect. It was a young player accidentally putting words to an organizational insecurity that nobody in that building would ever admit to out loud. And I think that's the part people forget. Cleveland didn't just draft Gabriel because they liked his tape. They drafted him early enough, ahead of Sanders, to make a statement, to say, we see something here that the rest of the league is missing, and we're willing to bet on it publicly. That's a gutsy move. It's the kind of move front offices love to make when they think they found an inefficiency nobody else spotted. A value pick that will make everyone else look foolish in a year or two. But it's also the kind of move that can blow up spectacularly if the guy you passed on turns out to be exactly who everyone always said he was. And that's the trap. When you draft a player specifically to prove a point about another player, you're not just betting on talent anymore. You're betting your own credibility. You're putting your evaluation process on trial in front of the entire league, and there's no quiet way to lose that bet. Every game, every practice report, Every off-season update becomes a referendum on whether you were right. Fast forward to now, and that's precisely what's happening. Reports coming out of ESPN discussions paint a picture where Gabriel barely gets mentioned anymore. When the conversation turns to whether Sanders can win this job outright, Gabriel's name comes up almost as an afterthought, and usually just to point out how far he's fallen out of the race entirely. There's even chatter about whether Cleveland simply decided Gabriel isn't a fit anymore, that they found someone else who better matches what this new staff wants to run, and that if the situation continues down this path, moving on from him entirely becomes a real conversation rather than a hypothetical one. Think about how brutal that is. This isn't a guy who had one bad game and is getting piled on unfairly. This is a guy who was picked specifically to prevent this exact scenario. And the exact scenario happened anyway, in real time, in front of everyone who once argued he was the smarter pick. Let's look at the numbers because they back up everything the Whisper campaign is saying. 937 passing yards last season, 7 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, started 6 games, went 1-5. Now look, for a rookie getting thrown into the fire mid-season, those numbers aren't disastrous. I want to be fair here, because it's easy to pile on a young player after the fact. He didn't turn the ball over constantly, he showed flashes, and 1-5 as a starter doesn't automatically mean the losses were his fault. Rookie quarterbacks lose games behind bad offensive lines and thin receiver rooms all the time. But here's the thing about being fair. Fair doesn't change the calculus a new coaching staff has to run. Survivable isn't the bar when you were drafted in the 3rd round to be the long-term answer. Survivable doesn't build a quarterback room around you when a brand new coaching staff walks in with no obligation to defend the old regime's gamble. Todd Monken isn't grading Gabriel against replacement level. He's grading him against what the position needs to look like for this team to actually compete, and that's a much higher bar to clear. And that's exactly what's happening with Todd Monken. He didn't inherit any sunk cost feelings about Gabriel. He's watching practice reps with completely fresh eyes, and from what's being reported, he doesn't like what he's seeing. There was a report from The Athletic detailing a 7-on-7 period where Gabriel got exactly 3 competitive reps. 3. Not 3 series, 3 individual reps. Let that sink in for a second. In a practice setting where every rep is precious, where coaches are constantly trying to build evaluation data on every quarterback in the room, giving a former 3rd-round pick only 3 real opportunities isn't an accident. It's a message. It's the kind of thing that gets buried in a stat sheet but screams volumes to anyone who understands how practice scripting actually works. Coaches don't hide their intentions in rep counts, they reveal them. That's not a coach trying to keep a competition alive for the cameras. That's a coach who has already made a decision internally and just hasn't said it out loud yet, because saying it out loud creates a media firestorm he'd rather deal with later in the summer than in the middle of June. Meanwhile, on the other side of this story, Shedeur Sanders has been doing exactly what he told everyone he'd do the moment that entertainers and competitors' comment first surfaced. He brushed it off immediately. Told reporters that words don't affect him, that he wasn't tripping about it, and that he actually believed Gabriel when Gabriel came up to him afterward and said the comment wasn't directed at him. There's something almost mature about that response, honestly. A lot of guys in that spot, especially a guy who's dealt with as much noise around his name as Sanders has since draft night, would have let that comment fester, would have carried it into the season as motivation, made it into a storyline of its own. Sanders just let it go. Whether that's actually true or not, whether Gabriel really meant it innocently, almost doesn't matter anymore, because Sanders refused to let it become a distraction. He let his play do the talking instead. And lately, his play has been talking loudly. Monken has publicly praised Sanders' development, specifically calling out his ability to work through his progressions, get the ball out on time, and grasp the new offensive scheme. He's even said Sanders has come miles from where he looked back in April's voluntary minicamp. That's not a small compliment coming from a first-year head coach who has every reason to stay neutral publicly, who has no obligation to hype up a rookie unless the tape genuinely earns it. Coaches in that position usually protect themselves with vague, non-committal answers about every quarterback in the room. The fact that Monken is willing to single Sanders out, this specifically tells you something real is happening behind the scenes. And it's not just Monken. Reports from Mary Kay Cabot suggest Sanders is picking up this new offense quickly, which according to sources close to the situation, is a huge reason this competition is even being kept open instead of Monken simply handing the job to Watson by default the moment he's healthy enough to take snaps again. Here's what really gets me about this whole situation. There's a difference between a rookie who talks about competing and a rookie whose competitiveness is so obvious that teammates start defending him unprompted in interviews. Nobody asks a locker room to go to bat for a guy who isn't earning it. Veterans in that room have seen plenty of hyped-up prospects come and go, and they don't waste their credibility talking up someone who isn't putting in real work behind closed doors. Multiple players inside that building have started calling Sanders one of the most talented young quarterbacks in the league, not because he's out there hyping himself up, but because what they're watching in practice every single day matches everything the coaching staff and the beat reporters are now saying publicly. That kind of alignment from teammates, from coaches, from the media, that's not hype. That's a pattern forming in real time, and patterns like that are usually the most reliable signal you're going to get before a season actually starts. And look at where this leaves Gabriel. Bleacher Report's Mo Moton has already put a number on his trade value, estimating he'd fetch something like a 2027 6th-round pick and a 2028 7th-round pick if Cleveland decided to move on. Think about that for a second. 2 years ago, he was a college quarterback teams were debating in draft rooms across the league. A year ago, he was a 3rd-round pick with a real shot at a starting job. Now, his market value has collapsed to the kind of picks teams use on developmental long shots and camp bodies. A former 3rd-round quarterback, drafted specifically to be a long-term piece, now being valued somewhere around late day 3 draft capital. That's not just disappointing. That's a verdict. That's the league quietly telling you everything you need to know about how this situation is being viewed from the outside, without a single team having to say his name in a press conference. Other outlets are already framing Cleveland's quarterback future as running through one of 2 paths. Either Sanders wins the job outright, or the franchise goes out and drafts someone entirely new in 2027. Notice what's missing from both of those scenarios. There's no real path back for Gabriel in either version of that future. Nobody is writing a third path where he quietly develops into the guy over another year or two. That door has effectively closed, even if nobody in Cleveland's front office has walked over and locked it publicly. When analysts start talking openly about a former high pick's trade value instead of his upside, that tells you the internal decision has probably already been made, even if nobody in that building is willing to say it publicly just yet. Front offices leak these things on purpose sometimes, softening the ground before an actual roster move so the reaction isn't as jarring when it finally happens. What makes this whole thing so fascinating to me is how symmetrical the irony is. Gabriel wanted to draw a clean line between people who compete and people who just generate attention. He wanted that quote to define him as the serious one, the grinder, the guy who shows up and does the work while somebody else soaks up the spotlight. He wanted the storyline to be about substance over hype, about tape over talk. And on paper, that's not a bad message to try and send as a young player trying to establish an identity in a new locker room. The problem is that the message only holds up if the results back it up over time, and results are exactly where this entire thing fell apart for him. Now that exact quote is being used against him by the same media that once let it become a national talking point. It's been flipped, twisted, and thrown right back at him every time his name comes up in a quarterback conversation he's no longer really part of. Meanwhile, the guy he was allegedly needling has become the actual headline of Cleveland's quarterback room, and he didn't have to throw a single verbal jab to get there. He never fired back, never addressed it publicly beyond that one brief moment, never turned it into a rivalry storyline for the cameras. He just kept improving, kept quietly climbing, and let the coaching staff's own praise do the talking for him, which in the end turned out to be a far more effective strategy than anything he could have said in a press conference. I don't think reversals like this happen often in the NFL. Rookie quarterback battles rarely flip this hard within a single offseason, especially when one guy was drafted a full 2 rounds ahead of the other, specifically to settle the argument before training camp even started. Usually, these things take years to sort themselves out. Usually, there's a slow bleed, a gradual shift in playing time, a front office that keeps hedging its bets for multiple seasons before finally admitting which player actually won the job. This one didn't take years. It barely took one full off-season cycle, and that speed is exactly what makes it so brutal to watch unfold from the outside. That's what makes this situation must-watch heading into the season. Gabriel had every advantage last year. A staff that believed in him, an injured rival on the sideline, and draft positioning that was supposed to end this conversation before it began. Every variable was set up in his favor. He didn't seize the moment when it was fully his, and now he's paying for it in a way that's playing out publicly, rep by rep, report by report. And now the same storyline that once made him look like the obvious answer is being used to write him out of the picture entirely. It's almost poetic in a cruel sort of way. The exact framing that was supposed to protect him has become the framing that's burying him. Meanwhile, Sanders quietly becomes exactly what he always claimed he'd be: unbothered, ascending, and honestly, impossible to joke about anymore. I'll be keeping a close eye on how Cleveland handles this over the next few weeks, because a decision this loud in practice usually doesn't stay quiet in the roster for very long.